food, but for us to talk about trauma really, and it's a big subject, and I just wanna we can talk about it, but I just wanna be clear that we don't know I don't know much about clinical stuff, meaning like how therapists, so we're not therapists, we're not psychiatric and all that stuff. But we deal with trauma all the time, and that's what we're working with, you could say, right? So yeah, we good with that now?
Yep, sounds good. Yep.
Yeah. So how I would see and talk about trauma, in my experience working with many people, including myself, is basically what happened to us. Basically, is what trauma is that kept in the body. Because it's but in the clinical world or out there in the world, or I have when you say I have a trauma, meaning it's usually something that is like you were beaten up or you were in a war zone, like a big trauma. But if you really look at it, the way I see it, it's hard to draw a line where some of the things that happened to you is trauma and then some of the things that happened to me is not a trauma. But to me, it's what happened to us that we couldn't fully feel what happened or acknowledge, or we had to keep away. And that gets kept in the body, you could say, and that will hurt us. And there's a whole spectrum of it, and I see it. But so who determines draws that trauma and not trauma? Because that needs to be questioned within ourselves too, right? Okay, this is when my dad beat me, or when I was almost killed, or when I was raped, or whatever. Yes, that's a trauma. But is when I was bullied, or when someone spoke to me like that, is that not a trauma? We don't know that until we check our bodies. You see, so there's a discrimination that can happen that we might ignore certain things not to be trauma, and they don't take into inquiry maybe because it's so easy to work on the big thing. Yes, it's a low hanging fruit and it's all of that. So, but the way I see it, and then you can share it, but it's literally what happened to us that gets stored in the body. And the biggest trauma for me is the fact that I can't, when I express and felt my anger, I couldn't feel and express them. You could say that's the biggest trauma that I have, and all that things on top of it. I mean, I wouldn't use the language that's the biggest, I guess, because I could still get, go in a war zone, get almost killed or beaten up, and that might be a bigger trauma. But the seed of the way I had to deal with that situation was already planted. When I was bullied, I couldn't be angry. So that could, it didn't have to be a huge trauma. But the reason why it became a huge trauma because I couldn't fully be with myself and feel the anger and express that when that thing happened to me. On how I dealt with that situation can be a much bigger trauma because I couldn't. So which one is more scary? Maybe it was scarier to actually feel and express the anger rather than dealing with something, you see. So, but you don't know that until you check your body because the mind says, oh no, because this one happened to me. And as we know, we love to stay a victim if you repress emotions, right? So one of the best reasons to use trauma as your identity to stay a victim and all that stuff. So I mean, there's a whole things we can talk about and areas. But yeah, Dan, do you want to add anything about trauma or anything? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you said it well. I think I read Bessel van der Kolk's When the Body Keeps the Score. I read that like probably 10 or 15 years ago, or maybe I don't know when it came out, but right when it came out. And um, he talks in there about big T trauma and little T trauma, about like event trauma, like stuff happens, like Toshi was saying, like you're in war or you've been abused or whatever, that there's the event that happens and you get traumatized, and then that sort of the effects of that live in the body. And then the little T stuff is more like they call it developmental trauma sometimes, or CPTSD. It's like over a long period of time when you're subjected to, a parent that's unconscious or a parent that's emotionally or verbally abusive or something, or it could be somebody looking at you the wrong way over and over again, and you start to develop the belief it's like I'm doing something wrong or whatever. Um but what's interesting is Scott and I worked for a little while with some veterans in LA, like on Sunset Boulevard. Actually, they have like a you know place where guys come back from war and they live there for a bit. It's like a kind of a halfway house type thing. Guys that are really traumatized. And I was working with a couple of those guys, and what was funny is I thought going into it that we were going to be looking at a lot of the stuff that happened on when they were out and on the battlefield or in war or whatever. Um, like one of them had a mine IUD or whatever blow up, next to him, and it was just like that was like stuck in the system. And we did some of that, but it was funny because we did more around their childhood. It was like they that was a big piece of it. But one of the guys said to me, the only reason I signed up for the army was because of my child. I wanted to die because of my childhood. And so I just remember it was like really like, wow, like, and so that was his little T trauma that drove him into the war where he had the big stuff happen. But yeah, I don't know if like Toshi said, like, I don't know if I differentiate that much between when I'm working with people between repression and trauma. The only time that I do is when people say there is this one event that I want to work on.
Mm,
But even then, it's like we'll go to that event and we'll go into the body and we'll look at it, and it'll be the repression mechanism. It'll be that when you got abused, you couldn't, push the person off. You couldn't express your anger or your power, and so you're stuck in that state. Um, so yeah, I don't know if I like to, and we never use that word when we're like market, just because like Toshi said, we're not clinicians and we're not qualified to say this is your trauma, and. Um, but pretty much everybody that I work with, that's what it ends up being, is it's like the what's stuck in the system that's been held back or held down.
mm.
What is that? And then that's the root of your suffering, right? So that's like you could call that your trauma.
Yeah, and yeah, and even if it's a little trauma, the initial plan, we don't know that if you're not a child, how big those impacts were when we were young, right? You see, and the seed of that trauma has been planted. Then I worked with people who's had like horrible injuries to some war stuff, to being kidnapped and all that stuff. And but as Dan says, when you work on it, it's how that person took that situation to be the initial reaction. But the initial reaction comes from the reaction you made when you're young to be a certain way, to move this way, or to avoid certain way, or take in what happened to you, or to blame yourself instead of others, and all that things can take in. And if you're not, it's really, you really start to see when you work with event traumas. We the main aim for me or for us is to actually get them to see what's underneath it, and how did we perceive that, how did we become a victim, even how did we interpret the situation when that awful thing happened to you. But because it's all in the way we interpret it, because there's nothing we can do about the fact that it happened. And it's quite amazing how, like, we just always go back to the childhood stuff that really, and then that seems to be more scary to the body when we check the body than the actual thing. But we never dismiss the fact that the big traumas are just the same as little ones, because for one reason for sure, like, how Dan said it as well, and I feel I agree as well, like eventually when a huge thing that happens, you have to really slow it down and really take it easy and work with that, because there's one side of it, we get so much out of it too. It's horrible, but we get a lot of identities and all this, everything's built around that, especially when something really bad happened to you when you're young. Your whole persona is built around that too. And there's a real needs that are met by believing that and keeping it there. But also the reaction and the fear and everything else that come up when we actually unpack it. But when we do it from consciousness, when we do it from awareness, we can be with all the biggest fears, all that stuff, right? But there has to be some sort of safety or like a titration or kind of slowing down that is needed, basically, that we have to deal with. So
Yeah.
we are aware of those because we can't just go in there and then we just don't want to feel it. And if you don't pass that stage, you can't get anywhere. The initial wall that has to be kind of be made conscious. Yeah.
Yeah, like when it's the same type of thing, like when someone comes with a diagnosis like depression or anxiety or addiction or whatever, it's like you've got the thing that you think you're dealing with. I got my trauma, I've got my depression, I've got my anxiety. And we could, like we could say to people, and we do sometimes say it's like you're not depressed, you're emotionally repressed. You know what I mean? Like that's what your depression is. It's the thing in your body going, you can't express your anger, you can't express your hurt, whatever. And so we could say that right away, but also we kind of have to honor where the person's identified that this I'm suffering because of my addiction or my trauma or my depression or my anxiety, you know? And so it's like, well, yeah, you are. I mean, you are because you've decided that that's what it is. So let's see what it really is. You know what I mean? Let's like unpack it and see what's really going on under the hood, you know? What are like the real actual mechanics of it? Because trauma is just kind of sometimes it's like you know, what's the word? Like rant, I don't even know the word. I'm trying to think of the word. It covers, you know, what is that even? What is trauma?
Yeah.
What is that? Oh, okay, it's this. It's this for you. And this is what happened when you were in that situation. So let's work with that and see if we can pull it apart, you know? So, yeah.
Because some most of the people, I mean, a lot of people I know, and including myself, I didn't know that was a trauma until someone said, "No, that's really trauma." It was not right,
Yeah.
But because it's so normal to some of us, especially like CPTSD, where it's a constant trauma that keeps happening. You just know that's normal. That's how you grew up. Your dad is always like this. My mom is always like this. Never safe. But that unsafety is the way I feel all the time, or something like. So yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. It's nebulous is the word I was looking for. Nebulous term. It's like how people use narcissist for everything these days, that type of thing, where it's like, okay, come on now. What is that? What are we talking about here? And of course, that's the same thing with narcissism. It's like it's rude. That's emotional repression too, So, but yeah, I think you have to let people find it first. Yeah, Toshi said it's like it's normal. This is normal life is suffering for me because of
Yeah.
what happened. And it's normal for a little while, and then I realize it's suffering, and then I name the suffering trauma or depression or whatever. And then I can come into KI and start to deconstruct it.
Yeah.
So,
Because I could say I am a trauma. Like I'm built of that stuff. Like, the way I speak, the way, you could say that and the way I'm coming from, right? So, but that doesn't really make sense to the outside world in some way because it has a certain, but that's why I mean the terminology is what it covers a lot of things. And it's a sensitive word too, it's a people get, have a lot of attachment to it or detachment to it or, or lots of triggers with it too. So yeah, um,
or whatever.
I have bigger trauma than you, Dan. but we can have that conversation too. But that's what I mean by it's amazing when we start to do this work, we can talk like this without kind of offending each other or whatever because when we see the fact that I was defending that. I had to stay a victim because of this has happened to me. So I have to, I am like this and you should never talk to me. You should, all this idea about how women should be or men should be or how I should be, so many of those things come from the trauma, meaning being a victim of something, right?
Yeah.
But this work is about claiming that back too, so that you can actually own that trauma. You don't have to be a victim of it. But we get something out of being a victim of it. But that's the bit that we have to see. Yeah.
The power of identity, right? Because it's like for me, I remember I was in 12 step for a while, and I had a friend of mine who's kind of more into non-duality, and he said to me one time, you really need to you're not really an addict though, right? You're not, that's not who you are. And I remember getting offended. I was like, yes, I am. You know what I mean? Like, of course I am. Because it was like I was landed on that and I was like leaning on that identity for safety and love and all that. So he was by saying that he was like trying to take it away from me. I remember I went back to him after I did the depression work and I was like, thank you for saying that, like thank you for like sort of like shocking me out of that for a moment back then because that was helpful. But yeah.
Right. And it's there all the time. But now it's allowed to like, oh, come. But it only took you to speak up about that or just point to yourself to that to bring your consciousness that way, right? Yeah. So we're just talking about bath trauma stuff basically because I've been really working on bath trauma stuff really recently. And there's been some lot of because I've had complication on how I was born. I thought I've worked on it a lot through KI, but I'm touching another layer of it. And I've been speaking to some of my mentees and trainees about what they've been through. So this is I could do a whole meeting about this, but it's just about really, you can't. go in like you can when you're starting KI or something. You really have to kind of treat it, slow it down gently, kind of be with it a couple of times a day. Just keep looking into it sometimes, and it just comes because it's really fundamental to who we are. It's the way I raise my hands. It's the way I turn around. It's the way I say. It's that fundamental. Like it's like it's my first experience of ourselves. But there is a clear imprint, so you can reverse things. You can go into it, but you can get to a place where reverse doesn't work or rapid fire doesn't really work anymore. It just feels it can't it wouldn't. The shield is so precise or something. So but we all explore in this, but